Welcome to today's math lesson on identifying functions from tables and mapping diagrams. Our do now reads, Jasmine has started skipping class. The graph displays her number of absences in relation to her grade in math class. So number of absences is our independent variable and her grade is our dependent variable. Since her grade depends on her number of absences, we have to figure out what is the slope and the y-intercept of Jasmine's graph. So in this case, our y-intercept is the easiest thing to identify since it's the point at which the line crosses the y-axis, and that y-intercept is 80. And to figure out our slope, we're finding our change in y over our change in x. And so starting with our change in y, so our y-intercept is going to be one of the points that we're using to identify the slope. And then I'm going to choose this second point right here. I'm finding the distance that we went either up or down. In this case, we went down, so I know that our slope is going to be negative, and 80 minus 60 is 20, so our change in y is negative 20. And then our change in x is 1, 2, 3, so our slope is negative 20 over 3. If we wanted to, we could also write this as a decimal, so we just divide negative 20 divided by positive 3. So our TEK for today's 8.5G, again, we're identifying functions using tables and mappings, and our DOL is given 4 problems. Scholars will identify functions using tables and mappings with 100% accuracy. Some academic vocabulary words to go over are the words function, input, linear function, and output. Essential question is, how can you identify and represent functions? So functions are equations that have an input and an output. And an input is the x value while an output is the y value. And when we talk about linear functions in particular, in specific, we can write the equations y is equal to k times x, which is the linear equation for proportional relationships, and y is equal to mx plus b, which is the linear equation for non-proportional relationships. And as you can see for these two equations, there's an input, which is the x value, as well as an output. And so another way to remember the input is that's the number or that's the value that you're putting into the equation, and then the output is what you're getting out of the equation after you solve for it. So to go into more detail, a function assigns exactly one output, one y value to each input, each x value. The value that is put into a function is the input, and the result is the output. And a mapping diagram, which is shown below right here, can be used to represent a relationship between input values and output values. A mapping diagram represents a function if each input value is paired with only one output value. So that means that there can't be multiple outputs for the same input. So in this case, since each input value is paired with only one output value, the relationship is a function. So for this first IG, we're given 2 tables, and we have to determine whether each relationship is a function. We're going to explain why or why not. So think about the input as the x and the output as the y. So when the input is 1, the output is 10. When the input is 5, the output is 8. When the input is 4, the output is 6. When the input is 1, the output is 4. When the input is 7, the output is 2. As you can see, this table is not listed with the input values from least to greatest. And we can also identify that there's 2 inputs, 2 of the same inputs, and there's different outputs. So that's our indicator, or that's what tells us that this is not a function. Because there can only be one output for every input. There can only be one y value for every x value. And then when we look at this table right here, we see when the input's 5, the output's 7. When the input's 10, the output is 6. When the input is 15, the output is 15. When the input is 20, the output is 2. And when the input's 25, the output is 15. So for every input, there's only one output, and so this is a function. This next I do is a multiple choice question, and we have to determine which statement is true about the representation, the mapping diagram. So on the left side is our input, and on the right side is our output. And so even if it doesn't say input output, you just have to remember that the left side will always be the input or the X values, and the right side will always be the output or the Y values. So answer choice A says the mapping represents Y as a function of X because each Y value corresponds to exactly one X value. B says the mapping does not represent Y as a function of X because two of the X values correspond to the same Y value. C says the mapping represents Y as a function of X because each X value corresponds to exactly one Y value. And lastly, D says the mapping does not represent Y as a function of X because there are more X values than different corresponding Y values. So looking at this mapping diagram, we can see that when the input's 4, the output's 5. When the input's 8, the output's 5. When the input is 12, the output is 10. And when the input is 16, the output is 15. So each input has its own output. Each input has exactly one output, even if the output is the same. And so it is a function. So we're going to cross out B and we're going to cross out D. And then we have to read the reasonings as to why. So for A, it says because each Y value corresponds to exactly one X value. And that's not true because, as you can see, the Y value is the same. So it's C because each X value corresponds to exactly one Y value. Now it's time for your DOL. So there's 4 problems and it's in a Google form. Thank you so much for following along in today's math lesson and see you in the next math video. Bye.